Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Joe Green. Joseph E. Green is the name he uses for the title of his books, and I've read through two of them. They're titled Dissenting Views, Investigations into History, Philosophy, Cinema, and Conspiracy. And there's two volumes, so volume 1 and 2. Collections of essays, but really a fascinating read. I've had some other guests about JFK conspiracy. One is Philip Nelson, and he actually writes about them. And I learned a lot from reading through a lot of his material. He has a lot of experience within kind of the JFK assassination community. His website is his name with JFK at the end. So it's www.joegreenjfk.com. And I'm delighted to have him. So Joe E. Green, thank you for agreeing to the interview.
Oh, you bet, William. It's a pleasure to be on.
Cool. So for people who may not have heard your background, I heard you on another podcast. Can you kind of tell, you have a history with the JFK research community, the JFK assassination. Maybe you can just take your time and talk about your background and how you became interested in that subject.
Sure. Yeah. I probably the first time, it's kind of a weird story, but the first time I actually got interested in the Kennedy assassination as such was I was hired to write a script by a guy, an independent producer out in Austin, who wanted to make a film that had elements of the JFK conspiracy in it. It wasn't a JFK movie per se, but he wanted to have allusions to that. And so I was like, okay. So he gave me a couple of books to read, and I read them, and I was kind of astonished to see that it wasn't nonsense. My father was a professor, and so I grew up around professors and in academia, and conspiracies are not something that academics get into on any level. And so I had never taken any of that seriously, even after watching the film JFK, the Oliver Stone film, which is terrific, back in 91 or 92, whenever it came out. I had categorized it as a really superb example of filmmaking, but not necessarily. But it didn't turn my brain into thinking, well, maybe there really is something to this. It shows how abstract I was. I was also a kid. Anyway, so I was hired to write the script, and then in the process of doing that, which was like a 2-year process, and the film collapsed, which happens. I got interested specifically in a guy named John Judge, because I had read a book called Secret and Suppressed that was put out by Adam Parfrey. And one of the essays is by John Judge. It's called The Black Hole of Guyana. And that essay changed everything for me, although that was about Jonestown. It was not about JFK, but I thought it was a really stunning essay. And I thought, wow, I got to meet this guy. And I did. I live in San Antonio, so I drove down to Dallas in November, because John Judge headed up an organization called the Coalition on Political Assassinations, COPA. And when I read about that, I said, well, hell, I can do this. So I just drove to Dallas to the hotel, and I'm always early. Every time I go places, I always go really early. And I went in the morning, and I saw John Judge in the breakfast room, and we ended up talking for several hours. And basically that turned my head around to everything. And that was I'm very happy that that's the way it happened for me, because if I had pursued JFK solely, it's possible that I would have gotten wrapped up only in that assassination, because one of the things that made John Judge different was his mentor was Mae Brussell. And Mae Brussell, of course, got into everything. And once you are exposed to that, at least for me, it was a mind-blowing experience. And then I started to look into all these things and thought, good Lord, like,
right, there's a whole alternate history out there. You went to November in Dallas, so that was on the JFK. Would you remember what year you met John Judge originally?
It was either 05 or 06.
Okay, and he's passed away, unfortunately, for people who don't know.
In 2014, unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. But yeah, so you kind of have a direct pedigree all the way back to Mae Brussell. Maybe for people who don't know about the importance of her work and John Judge, you could talk a little bit.
Yeah, Mae Brussell. So Mae Brussell was a housewife who got interested in all sorts of things, but what she really got into was the Nazi connection in the U.S. after World War II. And once she started looking into this, in particular, the connection of what we might call the aristocracy in the United States, the families that go back to England, which of course feeds into the CIA because those guys are coming from Yale and from the older academic institutions. Well, once we brought in the Nazis after World War II, they started infiltrating everything. And May was on top of this. And so it enabled her, because she had this brilliant rational mind, she was able to make these connections in real time as it was happening. So Mae Brussell, if you start reading her shows or reading her material, she's creating an alternate history at the same time that it's happening. And 9 times out of 10, she's right. And that's the key thing. And the other thing that John Judge inherited from May and passed on to me is that what John wanted to do was to make himself useful to the world in every respect. So he would volunteer. He did all kinds of things in his life. And I think all that stuff is just as important as the conspiracy analysis.
So what were those other things that he did as well as conspiracy analysis? I mean, she was really famous for it because she looked into like the Lennon killings. She looked into Manson. She wasn't just a JFK, but that time, the 60s and 70s, is just rife with all kinds of
yes. Yeah. No, it's the perfect person in the perfect situation, because just as the world was or America was being taken over, you've got somebody who is seeing right through it at the same time. And so that approach is what John would always talk about at the COPA meetings. And he would bring in people. His idea was always to bring in people who had a level of expertise in what they were talking about in a particular subject. So if we're going to talk about forensics, he wanted to bring in somebody like Cyril Wecht or Gary Aguilar, somebody who has experience and is trained in those fields. And I always thought that made a lot of sense. And it also made a lot of sense to me to understand that what you're dealing with is not a single event. In other words, part of what makes the JFK assassination so easy, I guess, for the mainstream media to ignore is that they always treat it as an event in isolation. So, geez, why would this ever happen? Why would somebody, why does the government want to kill JFK? Well, you don't understand that unless you look at everything else that's also going on, because you had black operations that were in use that were overthrowing other countries. And those are the same guys, essentially, who plan and execute the murder of Kennedy. And then later, the murder of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and a whole bunch of Black Panthers.
Hampton, right? You have Hampton.
And Fred Hampton, yes. And then you get to Jonestown, and you get to all kinds of other stuff that's going on. And it sounds preposterous if you're just saying it, to someone, well, all these things are interrelated. They'd say you're ridiculous. Except if you actually start doing the work, then you start to realize, oh, these things really are connected to one another. And they're connected. They're specifically getting rid of people who will make it a problem for this right-wing behemoth that is now running the United States as we see right now.
Right. I mean, it really is this kind of deep state thing, goes all the way back.
Yes.
I mean, that was coined by, well, you mentioned his name in there. Gosh, I can't remember. Deep state. Do you remember his professor?
So Peter Dale Scott.
Deep politics. Sorry. Yeah.
Deep politics. Parapolitics is what Ken Thomas calls it. And you're right. Mae Brussell had an influence on all that stuff to the point to where, Paul Krasner was the first person who published May. And Krasner was very much of, how do I want it? It's he represented the counterculture as I prefer it. It's very much my thing. Like Krasner was a comedian. He was extremely witty. He was a satirist, but he was also investigating real things. A little bit like Robert Anton Wilson, I guess. And so it made perfect sense that May would be published by Krasner. And then, of course, later on, she grew to influence all kinds, John Judge, Alex Constantine, any number of people that work in this field.
sorry to interrupt, but that O'Neill book,
Yeah,
Chaos, a lot of that was influenced by her. I mean, there's a lot. She was a precursor to that book, in my opinion.
yeah. I mean, I probably that's a
Some of it,
topic for another thing.
right?
I was less excited by Chaos than the people were, and maybe I was even a little hard on it when I first read it. I mean, it's a perfectly fine book. I do think it's funny that just now we have semi-mainstream books that are getting about 50% of the way that Mae Brussel got in real time.
Right, good point.
So it's I was like, okay, yeah, I mean, this is all to the good, but it's also in May, and I didn't think that it added a lot to that discussion. But it's probably for another. That's a whole topic for another show.
Right, but I mean, but you have these connections to these long-term researchers and a lot of people. Like it's really its own community of Shelley and some of these other characters. Weck pops up a lot in that. I mean, can you talk about that? And you got asked to be involved, and that was the intro to your first book. Your first volume is the intro, or the King Kill 63, where you really met a lot of them.
Yes. Well, okay. So, actually, the reason I got hired onto, let me back up some more. Because originally I was hired to work on a script for a film called Dallas in Wonderland. And the reason I got hired with that was because I had connections in everything. So they needed someone they needed someone who would be a good person to get people to go on camera, but also that wouldn't want to take over the production. Because sometimes they had approached, let me put it this way, they had approached other people. They had approached, I think, 2 other people before they got to me. And in both of those cases, the person that they were trying to hire essentially wanted to run the entire production. Well, that's, Hollywood doesn't work like that. And because I'm a playwright and I've written, screenplays before and things, I have somewhat of an understanding of that. And they also liked that part of it. So I ended up getting tied up with this Dallas in Wonderland production for several years. And which also came into existence a documentary called King Kill 63. Now, in the film Dallas in Wonderland, the protagonist was a documentary filmmaker who was making a film about the Kennedy assassination. So the conceit was that we would make the film that he was making, and the film never got made. This is a 4-hour discussion that has more to do with Hollywood than anything else. Despite the fact that there was a lot of real excellent talent signed up for that movie. Anyway, it fell through. And when that fell through, the documentary also fell through. And so as a result, that film has only ever been seen once at the Dallas International Film Festival in 2015.
Was King Kill 63?
Yeah, King Kill 63, the documentary. Oh, wow. We showed it.
I think something like that is on. I thought it was on Amazon. Or I did not.
You may see a thing for it. You can find it on IMDb. You can find the stories that were done on it in Variety, but it never had an official release, and I don't know if it ever will. I have no idea. You may be thinking of The Searchers. The Searchers is a different documentary that Randy Benson did that I was not involved in the same capacity. I was a research person for that, but I wasn't, involved in the scripting and any of that stuff.
Right. It is on IMDb.
Yeah, it's on IMDb, and I wish the hell people could see it because I thought it was great, and it got a fantastic reaction in Dallas when we showed the thing. I answered questions after the film until they kicked us out, basically. But yeah, we got Searle for that, and Richard Belzer, and Joseph McBride, Jim DiEugenio, and Oliver Stone, who gave us a 3.5-hour interview, which is amazing, and helped us out with Warner Brothers. He was fabulous, and he didn't know us when we came in. But of course, Oliver Stone, just made his own film, which also had its own distribution problems in the United States at first. So it's still the third rail of American politics, as they say. The JFK assassination remains a very touchy subject and very difficult to get stuff made.
It's still incredible up to this time, and they still were supposed to release information, and they still didn't do that. So it's really incredible.
Yeah, and
it's
amazing. Yeah. And so with every year that goes by, it's another way to the question of what are they hiding? Like, what are they waiting for?
Right.
What is
And
the
maybe,
purpose?
right. I mean, there's something there that they don't want to talk about. So you went in your book, you talk about meeting Belzer, Dick Gregory, all these kind of giants on the into the investigation. Belzer, I forgot the name of his book that he wrote, but he wrote
He's written three #1 bestsellers that touch upon
all
the
on the
Kennedy
Kennedy.
assassination.
Oh, I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Dead Wrong and gosh, I don't remember all the titles, but he's
I
written 3 books on
remember.
the subject. And
Okay.
oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I remember one was really covering all the people who died around the assassination.
Yes, he sort of inherited the mantle of Penn Jones Jr., who focused very much on the deaths after the Kennedy assassination. That was Penn Jones's focus. Yeah, Penn Jones was another guy who was a big influence on John Judge. Penn lived in Texas, and had run a small press in this tiny little town. And it was really funny because the newspaper that he ran would have articles about people selling milk, or what the price of Ma's pies are, and then there'd be this editorial by Penn Jones about the Kennedy assassination. And he got firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan. Penn Jones's incredible story. They have at the Baylor Library at the University of Baylor in Waco. They have a collection of Penn Jones's stuff, and I've been through it many, many times. There's a lot of great information. A number of other JFK people have also sent their stuff to them, including John Armstrong and Dick Russell. A lot of really excellent work, and Jack White, if you know Jack White.
Some of these names are familiar to me. Like I don't remember the name. I've never heard of Ben Jones. I've heard of some of these other names are very familiar to me, but I'm glad I'm talking to you because I didn't know some of these other researchers. You like some of that early research. You got people who are listening. It's prior to the internet. It's prior to the media was
way
so much
before.
different.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I think I think that's Sorry, please continue.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, and there were people somebody that I admired very greatly, Vincent Salandria. Vince immediately, like the weekend of the assassination, thought that there was something hanky. As soon as Ruby shot Oswald, he said, "Well, this is impossible." And Salandria started working on the case instantly, like right at the top. And there were people who were like that. Ben Jones is another one.
Fascinating. Salandria was a lawyer too, right? Wasn't he from like New York City?
Yes, Salandria was a lawyer. He died fairly recently now. God, is it almost been 2 years? Anyway, Vincent Salandria was the sweetest man on earth. He was excellent and very, very, very intelligent. And his articles are still very much worth reading.
And it was kind of like a great unraveling, like the progression of trying to get it. Just people are adding more and more information, but there's also some mis and disinformation in that whole process of unraveling JFK. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, there's been it's funny because the mainstream media frequently refers to JFK assassination books as a cottage industry, which ignores that there's an enormous industry of producing books that are essentially full of lies in an effort to drown out the books that are good. So Vincent Bugliosi allegedly got paid $1 million to write that, atrocious thing that he did. And I saw somebody the other day was trying to prop up Gerald Posner again, which is amazing to me because all you have to do is Google Gerald Posner's career in the last 20 years, and you will quickly see why nothing he does can be trusted. And I'm not going to go into the details of anything, but it's a Google search away.
He's still around. I think one of his books, Posner's still at it. You actually contributed. It was interesting because you critiqued this book. I had this, and I was amused.
Hellhound on Australia.
See you critique this. I was reading through it too. I was like, there's some problems here. But it's important for people, listeners, to understand there's a lot of dis and misinformation, and some are benign. They're just not well informed, and then some, to me, there's a lot more cleverness and creativity behind some of those disinformation books out there.
There is a great deal of subtlety in some of these books, and it's hard for me to advise people in general. I think somewhere on my website I listed like my favorite Kennedy books, um, but some of this requires just a lot of homework and a lot of detail to understand why something is hanky. And I try to get it, and you've read my essays, so I try to explain point by point, like on Hellhound on His Trail, why this is not to be trusted, especially and it's one thing when everybody makes mistakes. Like I make mistakes all the time. Like that's something that happens. But if you were continually making the same mistake over and over again, and even when you're corrected, you're continuing to publish it over and over again, then there's probably a problem. You have an agenda of some kind.
No, it's very important, and I think that the JFK can be kind of like a petri dish for even larger things in our society, where other cases there's definitely misinformation agents or paid PR people who are letting it on. So I think that it's just something that you learn through trial and error, because I've investigated other criminal cases, and clearly there are operators who are deliberately spreading misinformation. And JFK is just a perfect example of that. Wow.
Very much so. And it also, you said you're an investigator. I was a private investigator myself for a couple of years. And
I'm just an investigative reporter, not a private. I've known.
Oh, okay.
I have a law degree. That's it.
Oh, well, beats me. I was doing mostly insurance cases, and occasionally criminal cases, but very obvious questions that you would ask in a normal criminal case never get asked in any of these other cases. If a lady who is married gets murdered, who probably did it? The husband.
Her husband.
And if the husband gets murdered, the wife probably did it, right? So there may not be what actually happened, but you got to ask that question. You have to go in and you say, if a jewelry store gets robbed, I want to talk to everybody who works there. Why do I want to do that? Well, because they know how the jewelry store works. They have inside information that might help. I'm also going to ask, you fired anybody lately, right? That would be a reasonable question to ask, because maybe somebody who's fired knows the internal workings of your business and also has a grudge. So we have a motive. And this is not to say that all of that is totally reliable. I mean, it could be a dark horse. Who knows? But those are reasonable questions to ask. But in these cases, those are totally, totally irrational. So if the president gets killed, you cannot ask whether the vice president knew about it. So that question is just totally off the table, because these people are gods. They cannot be questioned as to whether or not they would participate in the assassination of someone where they're going to gain a whole lot of power as a result, which is not to say that Lyndon Johnson did it. I don't believe that, but you have to ask the question, and that question then spirals on to other things. Does Alan Dulles have a motive? Well, he knows the internal workings of the government, and he recently got fired, so maybe that's a reasonable place to investigate. So it's really funny to me, like in all these cases, all of the sort of standard things you would do if I was investigating any kind of crime, the standard questions I would do, the procedure I would follow, they never are followed in any of these cases.
Right. It's MLK, crazy. RFK, all of them, right?
They're all the same. And even when Tippit got murdered in the Kennedy assassination, the police officers did not canvass the area. Like, that's nuts. Okay, if I investigated like a pharmacy holdup, I canvassed the area. It's a standard thing that you do, and they didn't do it on the Tippit shooting. Well, why not? Why are they ignoring police procedure?
Right, and that's just riddles the entire JFK event. There's so many things not investigated. Right. Yeah, I mean, and all of the Warren Commission and all that stuff. It's just like one of the main suspicious person you mentioned, Dulles, is sitting on the Warren Commission, and with John J. McCloy, it's just off the charts. I mean, the insiders have to know it's brazen. Like, to the people who aren't familiar with DC politics or may not be readers or political junkies, they may go, "Oh, this is strange." But the insiders, when they saw McCloy and Dulles on there, they just had to have like a laugh, chuckling at the club, hanging out with the guys in the big leather-bound chairs. Like, it's just a total fix, man.
Well, and I think there's something to that. That, in other words, if you're doing a public execution of the president, then you have Alan Dulles and John J. McCloy essentially being the head of the investigation. Alan Dulles was I believe he was the only member who showed up to every single Warren Commission meeting. I think that's right. I think, but anyway, the point being, he was the most active member. That's signaling to everybody else in Washington that there's a new sheriff in town, and you need to get with the program.
Right.
And that message does come across because people do get with the program. You don't see a bunch of Washington insiders suddenly investigating the Kennedy assassination. And then later, when Garrison picks up the mantle, Garrison is destroyed, essentially, from the inside out, because he has chosen to be the person that's going to stand up to the entire government, which has now changed.
Right. It was a huge coup, but the mechanics of it were much, in my opinion, much broader than people think. Like I think you're saying that.
I tend not to get into. Oh, go ahead.
It's almost like the Caesar assassination. I liken it to when they killed Caesar. Everybody had to dip their blood to show they were part of the conspiracy. I think there was something akin to that happened sub rosa, beneath the surface, where everybody are you on board or not? Right?
Yes. No, I entirely agree with you. And you see that, again, pop up on down the line. I think part of what did happen is that the machine got a little out of control. Later on with stuff like Jonestown, you're like, what the hell are they doing? Like, what, where they kind of, it's like this black goo pops up the surface for a minute, and then they have to come and cover it up real quick. Because there's this evil that has inseminated itself into all of DC operations. Like I say, with the murder of Bobby Kennedy and the attempted murder of Teddy Kennedy and Martin Luther King, this is all part of the same thing. It's all part of the same structure, and that's the thing that I think is important to understand, because it's not a hobby. Like, if the JFK assassination is a hobby or a cold case for somebody to solve, like the Zodiac or the Jack the Ripper, people get into these things, then it doesn't have any effect on the rest of the world. But when you understand that the assassinations are connected, suddenly a lot of things become clear in American life, and it also becomes clear the nightmare that we are currently living becomes understandable.
Good point. So it goes back to really Kennedy, though, right? And it goes back 50 years, all this stuff that's happening. You could actually throw in the attempted killing of Ford, who would have benefited Nelson Rockefeller. You can throw in Reagan, right? I mean, there's a lot.
Yeah, and George Wallace. I talk about the shooting of George Wallace, which is a very bizarre shooting. This guy, Arthur Bremer, shoots him, and then he has a diary, and Gore Vidal says, I read the diary, and it looks to me like it was written by E. Howard Hunt, because he was aware of E. Howard Hunt's style. And E. Howard Hunt, pops up. He pops up in Chappaquiddick. He pops up all over the place, obviously in Watergate. But you could write just a little. I don't know. I thought about doing that, just a monograph of E. Howard Hunt's movements from 1960 to 1980, and it'd be a lot of fun. You'd see where he's like Zelig. He's popping up all over the place.
So true. Did you think that he was one of the tramps that were filmed on JFK? Have you confirmed that? Or
no, I don't think so. I don't. And I also photo identification. I'm not very fun as a JFK researcher, and I've realized this after a while, because I don't really get into photo identification. I hate photo identification. I because it always ends up being, you look at a picture of somebody and you look at a picture of somebody else and you go, well, maybe that's him. I don't know. So how do you ever get resolution on something like that? Also, the arguments about the Z film and whether, it's been altered or not. I mean, clearly it was altered, but how much alteration? I don't know. I think there's more fruitful lines to pursue in the case than those things, especially because I'm not a photographic expert. I'm not a visual expert. I know something about cinema, but that doesn't make me an expert on whether the Z film is real or fake.
Right. And you have that 10-point program in your book. This is the way that we should analyze these problems that we know are problems. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. that article, that was the first. I think that was the first article that got published by Jim Diogenio, which at that time was CTKA and has since become Kennedy's and King, and probably written more articles for Jim than anybody else. Now that I think about it, but it was also a pretty naive article on my part, because that was like 2000, maybe 2008 or so, and I did not fully understand at that point the conflicts that were going on between the between researchers, and how deep some of that ran. Because I had only been doing this stuff for a couple of years at that point, and although I had met a number of people, I was still very much a student. Like, I was a bright-eyed kid. I was like, oh man, like, this is so cool hanging out with Robert Broden, which it is. But I didn't have a level of understanding. These are guys who've been doing this for 20 years at that point, or 30 years, or 40 years. Jesus. And I don't think I would have written the article in the same way that I did then. But it was, I mean, it is still, I think, a pretty good idea to try to nail down some of the key points, because my idea was to try and get people to agree on certain things, and then we can decide how to pursue this together. Well, there is no together. There's just allies and hangers-on and enemies. And trying to put them all in one big tent was a mistake on my part, because it's just not going to happen. But I think the content is not bad. Okay.
What do you think the lines of disagreement are between those people that make them have bad blood? What are the main points? Do you know? You don't have to name names, but just the issues.
I was going to say that this wouldn't be a good place for me to go, because, so here's the thing, right? Some of this is intellectual. Some of it is intellectual property. So, there's this old joke about professors. They say, why is academic politics so dirty? And the answer is because the stakes are so small.
Right, I've heard that.
And there's something to that in the research community. So what happens in academia is you go and you become a professor, and then you're a professor, and this is your thing. This is what you do. I do, like in my father's case, he's a historian of Mexico, and very specific, a revolutionary decade in the 19th century. Like that's my dad's thing. And at that time, when he was a professor, I think there was one other professor who was sort of specializing in that, but he lived in Rhode Island, not next to Mexico. So that was a bad point on his part. But the point is that it can get ugly, because somebody decides that you're this, and then somebody else says, well, no, you're wrong. It's actually this. And the first person digs in their heels and says, no, the film is altered. Well, no, I think the film isn't altered. And then that becomes something bitter. But then there's a whole other thing, which is that you also find that people just don't like each other. So for whatever, and could be long history. You could write a novel about some of those disagreements, and those would go back a long way. And so those things, again, you can't really do anything about that. And if you're coming in from the outside, you don't realize at first. Like, there were times when I would think, wow, this person says actually something fairly similar to this person. I wonder if they get along. And the answer turned out to be no, that they hate each other because of something that has nothing to do with the case, but something to do with something personal, or who knows.
And I think that line comes from Henry Kissinger. I think he said that about academia. Was the stakes were so little. I think that goes back to him, which is another interesting thing. But
yes, yeah.
So there's been a lot of, the JFK community has gone and morphed, and people have passed away. Where do you think the people are now? Do you think that the interest is still there? Are people still kind of hanging out? Are there still COPA meetings, or how are things?
No, there's no. COPA ended when John died, and he was about to close shop anyways. As he recognized that he was getting older and he was having trouble walking and things. I think the interest is still there. There are still conferences that are going on. I haven't been to Dallas since I want to say either 2016 or 2018. So I couldn't tell you what the conferences are like now. I only would go to the COPA conferences. Um, so I don't do Judy Baker, and I haven't done the Lancer conference either. But I know that they still happen. And in fact, I just found out literally today, my buddy just told me that Judy Baker is having a thing in Austin because she moved to Austin now. So.
Oh, Judith Berry Baker, is that who you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah. So
Gotcha.
that's happening. Which I do not think is a positive development.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story about people in the JFK community, how authentic or how real they are or whatever. But that's all. Not really necessary subject matter for this conversation.
I couldn't tell you. I've had my experiences, and my experiences have not been positive, and I also don't. It's also the kind of thing that I just don't like. I don't like it when they're like the whole thing. There's been books that are written like this, where the whole thing is essentially a story, and it's this person, and they're saying that this is my story, and this is the thing, and I had sex with Lee Harvey Oswald or whatever, whatever that thing is. It has nothing to do with the case, and I have to basically say I either believe you or I don't believe you, and that's all I got.
Right. But it's not like it's not expanding the research and understanding of what happened, right?
It's not. I mean, if you believe this person, then it maybe changes a couple of things, but nothing really is gained, in my opinion. And again, it's just my opinion, and I've gotten hate emails before, and I'm sure I will again for saying this kind of thing. But what I like to see is I like to see somebody who is reading a text and then drawing conclusions from that text, rather than let me tell you my story, and it's always this wild thing. There've been books like that, and I mean, they're fine if you like them, but it doesn't. It's not what we're doing. It's like I'm going to write a novel, then write a novel.
Right.
But this is a different thing. Yeah.
It's almost like it's fictional too. I mean, some of these, I'm not specifically pointing out anybody's name, but I've had people talk to me about their story and they want to come on the podcast or broadcast.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, what? Can you verify anything? Yeah. What's going on? Where's the facts? Just write it out. No. And those people go by the wayside, but they're out there. So you just see people. There's people in the alternate community too. I mean, that's a whole nother story, but their stories are like I had I was associated with the guy who died in DC and blah, blah. And people, they've been busted. They've been exposed. But I mean, what maybe like so? Yeah. So the JFK, I mean, do you think that they'll ever? It's kind of like an open sore for the United States culture and history. Will it ever be resolved?
I don't think so. No. I mean, I don't. If you look at the country right now, and I don't want to seem despondent, but I think people have a good sense, and that's part of the malaise that generally is felt around the country, that we're coming to the end. That this is basically the United States is not going to be running for a whole lot longer. And that's just my impression. Things are breaking down on a very street level. I was talking to a guy the other day about getting a new dryer, and we started talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union, where getting things done, we just start to assume that it's just not going to happen. Like your postal service, maybe the mail comes today, maybe it doesn't, right? Starting to get that way. And it has to do with the general collapse of society that partially has to do with COVID. But the thing about COVID is people have started to really realize, like, where's my life going? Does capitalism make any sense? Do I have a chance to make it in this world, particularly if you're Generation Z and you have, $100,000 worth of college bills? Right. Like, what am I going to do with my life? I'm going to work at Starbucks. Is that what we're doing?
How am I going to buy a house? How do I afford this? Am I ever going to get out of debt?
Forget it. Forget. Like, you're never going to buy a house.
Bro, my $500 charge right now to the average family will bankrupt them. When my parents bought a house for $40,000, I think my dad made $5,000 a year. Like, to pay off the mortgage was nothing. A 30-year mortgage didn't even exist. Mortgage was done for 3 or 4 years. So this next generation, I mean, you talk about nihilism or hopelessness, psychological problems. It's because of this system in the society, in my opinion. Sorry.
That's what I think. And I think that that is either going to dissolve into nihilism and collapse, or you're looking at a revolution at some point. At some point in the next 50 to 100 years, you're looking at people are going to change the way things are being done. And I have to wonder if that isn't why some of these very wealthy people are moving out of the United States. And then some of them, of course, want to get off planet because they feel like the whole thing is going under, you know. Maybe.
Right. And I mean, you can tie it back to JFK, a slow progression of injustice, lacking of aristocratic power. And
there's this thing. Yeah, no, there's this thing that Plato talks about, which is the noble lie in the Republic, which is that a successful republic requires some type of thing to unify them, and it doesn't have to be true. It just has to work, and that, I think, is what gets killed on November 22nd, 1963, is that you can no longer believe in something that is unifying the country in any sense, because the king is dead. And once it becomes very, I mean, to me, it becomes very obvious that, Oswald is not the shooter, or even if he was the shooter, that he's not doing it on his own accord. And I think everybody gets that sense. And their attempts to cover it up and make it good again don't work. There's always been an underclass in this country which allows capitalism to function in the way that it functions. And this is one of the questions that I ask. I write a zine series for Microcosm Publishing that include like an introduction to JFK, an introduction to MLK and RFK. And I wrote one on Jonestown that went back to the history of Guyana. And my question is capitalism possible without slavery? And the answer is, we don't know, because it's never been tried. So if everybody understands this, if the 1% understand this, fine. But the more people that understand that reality, that can't live with that reality and can't recognize that maybe I can get out of this somehow, that's going to lead to perpetual malaise and disillusionment. That story, I think it's a Shirley Jackson story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. It's a short story. It's about a town where everything's great. And then this person is allowed to go down into the basement where there's this child who is tortured perpetually. And they tell that person, everything is great in this town, but we have to keep torturing this kid. Otherwise, everything will fall apart. And after they learn that information, some people stay and some people walk away. And I think that's kind of what's happening right now.
Right. Yeah, I think the consequences will be shorter. I mean, the near future of what happened during COVID and a lot of things that have happened in recent. I mean, I don't think that the corporate media, which is puppeteered by the powerful people, is holding its grasp upon the American mind anymore. And I think that that's going to cause a lot of problems and destabilization, because the system can't sustain itself. Cannot sustain itself. I'm sorry. We're almost like they're literally kicking the debt can down the street every 3 months, which, eventually just somebody's not going to want a dollar bill. It's not going to be worth anything like it. We're going to be at that's just one of the issues, hyperinflation, like Germany. And you're right. I mean, there's that's 1 out of 10 or 20 issues that are problems. So,
and as long as we had the most powerful military in the world and were seen as this beacon of liberty in the propaganda, that had some viability. But with the U.S. lacking that, we're no longer seen as this great hope for the world. And can we perpetuate this military solution to everything forever? Like, both of those things they're not going to work. So, something has to change.
Something's got to give. That's really it. Yeah. I mean, it's going to be an interesting couple decades coming up. I got to tell you, I don't know what's going to happen.
Yes.
I mean, so where's the best place? I mean, I've got your website here on screen. It's Joe Green JFK. tons of research. You've got a lot of tabs here: political writing, film writing, book scenes, and plays.
Yeah, yeah. That's the best place to go, and you can get it. I'm affiliated with the Hidden History Center, which you can always go to hiddenhistorycenter.org. You can get these links right off, and also ratical.org, ratical.org, which is run by Dave Ratcliffe.
I've heard of Dave Ratcliffe. What did he write about? I used to read him a lot.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Understanding Special Operations, which was his interviewing with Fletcher Prouty. But Ratcliffe has written a ton. I mean, if you go to ratical.org, you can read all his stuff. I used to read
him 20 years ago, I think. That's unbelievable. He was one of my go-to writers.
Yeah, no, he does fantastic work. Can't beat him.
I'll check that out. You have a podcast too,
also,
right, Joe?
Well, it's sort of. I tried to do a podcast, and I have one episode that I need to upload, and then I don't know what I'm going to do. Because it turns out that I'm not that great at doing a podcast. I need somebody to talk to. Like if I just sit there with the camera and talk, it doesn't seem to work.
I find that the interviewers, it works. You get somebody who has specialized knowledge like you, and it makes it a lot easier. Because I mean, there's a lot of stuff I don't know. Like your history of just the JFK community, assassination community, is so important because a lot of people don't understand the genealogy, Brussels to Judge to people like you to today that all work back.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's a really good book that John Killen did called Praise from a Future Generation, which does cover the early Kennedy researchers, and then they're split because there was a big split in the Kennedy community. Of course, it wasn't a community. But the reason why Sylvia Meagher didn't get along with Vincent Landry and things, and it basically has to do with Garrison. There were some people who decided that Garrison was doing a good thing and they tried to help him, and there were people who thought that Garrison was a disaster and actively got in their way. And that stuff even comes on closer to the present because it was actually a JFK researcher who, for example, released the JFK screenplay to either Time or Newsweek magazine, I forget. But when I think it was Time, when they reviewed the first script for JFK that Oliver Stone wrote with, oh gosh, I can't think of his co-writer right now. That was done by one of the early researchers who didn't agree with the fact that Garrison was the hero. That was the big split.
Oh, interesting.
So the only problem with it's a great book. This Kellen book is terrific. The only thing is he does not really cover Mae Brussel in it. So that's an unfortunate. But Feral House a few years ago did publish a collection of Mae's writing, which you can get. I think it's called The Complete Mae Brussel. I wrote a review of it, I don't know, 10 years ago or something. It was a long time. But that is available too. And I would highly recommend
She was one of the real early kind of talk radio, whatever. Yes. She had hundreds and hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours of stuff that she did, right?
And if you go to worldwatchers.info, you can listen to many of those original shows. My buddy Rob Folotico set that up. Unfortunately, Rob passed on a few years ago, but the site continues to be maintained, and you can get not all of her shows, but quite a few of them. Rob is a big loss. He was a very intelligent young man who I think knew more about Mae Brussel than anybody on the planet at the time that he died. But that's a great website that people can look at as well.
Cool. I mean, it's so important. And she was really kind of the one of the early parapolitical post-war, I mean, put it conspiratorial type journalist, like understanding that everything's conspiratorial after World War II in the United States.
Yeah. And arguably invented it. She got called the Queen of Conspiracy a lot, but it was a dismissive term because she was, quote unquote, just a housewife. May was a genius.
She's smart.
John Judge
Really
used to tell
smart.
me stories about May all the time. They would just, she'd take a newspaper and immediately see what was important and cut it out, and she'd be able to go through. And if you watch Randy Benson's documentary, The Searchers, he shows John Judge kind of showing the technique of looking at the newspaper and seeing what. John used to say something really funny that Mae Brussel used to read the paper, and then at a certain point, the newspaper got so bad that the only thing that was worth reading was the society pages, because that told you who was connected to whom. And you could draw all kinds of conclusions just from that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah. And she kind of had it rough. Like, I think she passed away early from cancer. Her daughter was in a car crash. Like, she thought some suspicious stuff happened to her.
She did. Yeah. She had these are stories that are sort of half remembered by me, so I may get some of these details wrong. But May, there was apparently a house across the street from where she was living that had been abandoned. And then all of a sudden, these two guys, and they were very clearly like FBI, there's these guys that wear suits and hats all the time and dark glasses and never do anything except watch her house. And she used to bake pies and bring them over and say, here you go, if you're going to be watching me, you should at least have some pie. So that was her attitude about things. She, she had people that would come, young people that would come to her house just to listen to her talk, and they would, they would have group meetings outside and just talk about stuff. I mean, she was amazing. I've never met her. She died in when I was like 10 years old, I think. So everything I have is secondhand through John.
I think she was Monterey, California, or somewhere
Monterey,
in Monterey
yeah.
Bay Area.
Yeah.
Back when it was more rural area.
Exactly.
Yeah, really something else. Well, Joe, is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, that's super helpful. Getting this history is very important, and where people can kind of find this information. I'll put your website if people want to reach out to you for contact information in the show notes. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap up?
That pretty much covers. I do have a new book. It is done. I've been trying to get it in print since late last year. It was supposed to come out like in October. It's going to come out fairly soon, but it's a bunch of, anyway, we had a lot of problems, but it's called Tinfoil Hat Not Included, and it will be out in the next month, maybe 2 months. I hate to make these predictions now because so many things have gone wrong. It's unbelievable. But pretty soon it'll be out. And I have a whole zine series at Microcosm Publishing, which if you look up that and put my name in there, you'll find I've written, 7 or 8 zines. And they're designed. So one of the things about Dissenting Views is that they're not written for beginners. They were written for outlets that are not for beginners, and so they are pretty academic. My zines are a little bit easier to read, so they're introductions to stuff. Like I say, MLK assassination, JFK assassination, Chappaquiddick, all kinds of things. So that's also something that.
Right. I mean, that's the Chappaquiddick thing. I had no idea that Hunt was involved with Chappaquiddick. You have to come back.
Oh man, yeah. No, the guy who did a bunch of work on Chappaquiddick is Robert Cutler. Cutler's one of my favorites. Again, a guy I never met. He died before I even got into this stuff. But I've become utterly fascinated with Robert Cutler, and he did a bunch of work on Chappaquiddick. His work is, and part of the reason that I wrote that zine, and I'm going to write another one pretty soon with his stuff, is because Cutler published his stuff in himself. Like he would make the documents, so there may only be like 300 copies of his Chappaquiddick book, and it's this like kind of a stapled thing, and I've got one of them, but they're very, very rare. They're hard to get. And so I wanted to introduce people to that in an easier way, and also say, hey, this guy was onto this case like right at the beginning. He also lived in that area, so that was helpful.
Just the real history of America isn't the topical history. It's the parapolitical history is really where the truth is. These are we're in a fake. I mean, you're really in a kind of a dystopian fake world, because what you're brought up, at least for me as a public school person, private schools, you're given a totally, it's like the equivalent of Wonder Bread. It's literally like denuded of any nutrients and any truth. And it really is a very scary thing to think. Like, I snapped out of it maybe in my mid-20s, but like there's people going, they talk about awakening, a wake up process, but like just everything is structured and fake, and it's really kind of like dystopian. It's really scary when you really look into, and I think that's part of your theme where you started out with. JFK didn't happen in a vacuum. There was things that led up to it, things after. Very dark, very dark.
But it's the truth, world. And that's and that's what's important, at least to me. I mean, I don't know what else to do. If regular history had been the truth, I would have gone along with it. But it turns out, it's not.
Me too. I spent a lot of time reading that regular history too. Like, oh wow, we gotta get this. And kind of like Napoleon said, history is bunk. He was right. He was right back then. That was like early 19th century. Anyway, it's great to talk to you. Super knowledgeable. Really appreciate your time, Joe. And I'll put your show notes. I'll put your book, and again, Tinfoil Hat. Can you give an idea of what's in the book, or just a general?
Yeah, it's more essays, but they're a little bit broader, and they're a little bit easier to read. Like, because I wanted people to be able to pick it up and get a taste of these things, and then go, oh, okay, I can decide what I want to move into next. Because that is the one complaint that I've gotten about Dissenting Views 1 and 2 over the years, is that it's not for beginners, and it's true. It's not. I mean, it's So if I would have done it differently,
well, you have a lot of experience. You have a lot of experience, so I mean that's the thing. But I would recommend people look through those books, because there's a lot of different subjects. You're critical about certain books, praising certain people. So I think that
absolutely,
people, to get down the right path, you don't go through some of these other books that may not be telling you the truth. But it's great to talk with you. Again, your website is joegreenjfk.com. The 2 books we talked about a lot of different subjects. Dissenting Views, Investigations in History, Culture, Cinema, and Conspiracy. Joseph E. Green is the publication name that he uses on the books, volume 1 and 2. So thanks so much for your time, Joe. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, William. It was really good talking to you.
Awesome. Thanks. All right, stay there.